Czechcast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Czechcast, the podcast where we explore all things Czech, history, culture, politics and the people whose stories shape them. I'm Vít Pohanka, your host, and if you listened to our previous episode, you may remember that I promised a conversation with Konstantin Kinský. That interview is still coming, but I decided to change the order of our episodes because of recent, quite significant news. The United States federal government has announced that it will end its funding of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Why is it important? Well, for anyone interested in Czech history, the answer is clear. RFE, RL, as it is known, then headquartered in Munich in Germany, played a major role during the Cold War in providing independent information to countries behind Iron Curtain, including Czechoslovakia. In the 1990s, the station moved to Prague, where it is headquartered at the moment that I'm recording this podcast. So, instead of an aristocrat, Konstantin Kinský, this time my guest is a journalist and someone with deep first-hand experience of both the BBC World Service and Radio Free Europe. Petr Brod left Czechoslovakia as still a teenager in 1969, then studied in Germany, Britain and the United States, and is a former colleague of mine from other BBC days. But he also spent years working for RFE RL in Munich and later in Prague. In our talk, among other things, he described the internal dynamics at the Czechoslovak section of RFE RL.
In every department you had a tribe of, let's say, old emigres and a tribe of new emigres. You had tribes organized according to ethnic lines, according to religious lines, according to whether you were Jewish or not, according to which emigre wave you belonged to.
We also talked about the fundamental difference between RFE RL and the BBC World Service.
The BBC was truly a world radio station, interested in anything that went on anywhere, if it was of significance transgressing the local borders.
And why, despite his deep respect for the BBC, Petr felt drawn to RFE RL.
One of the reasons I wanted to go to Munich to serve in Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty was that I simply wanted to devote a larger part of my working time to events directly concerning the target areas, events in the communist area that would eventually, we hoped, lead to the demise of the communist regime.
In this episode, we reflect on the legacy of Radio Free Europe, its role in Czechoslovakia's path to freedom, and what it means when a radio station with such a powerful history faces an uncertain future. You're listening to Czechcast, and I'm Vít Pohanka.
Czechcast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
As regular listeners of Czechcast will know, I prefer to meet my guests face-to-face or in a virtual studio if they happen to be in some faraway country. This time I had to make an exception since both Petr Brod and I were under time pressure, so we spoke rather hurriedly over the phone, and I started by asking Petr how he got his job at the Radio Free Europe in Munich in the 1980s.
Well, that is a tale of intrigue and complications, which is partly linked to the fact that there were in Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, in each of the departments aimed at a specific country, cliques or clans of people linked together by their lifetime experience, by their political views, by various friendships from the old country, and so on and so on. I called them tribes, in German Stämme. Mm-hmm. So in every department you had a tribe of, let's say, old emigres and a tribe of new emigres. You had tribes organized according to ethnic lines, according to religious lines, according to whether you were Jewish or not, according to which emigre wave you belonged to. And let me explain it with regard to the Czechoslovak service. Well, the Czechoslovak service of Radio Free Europe consisted of people who had come to Germany, to West Germany, of course, in various emigre waves. And the first one was the one that started in 1948 and continued into the early 1950s when the borders of Czechoslovakia were closed airtight. So those were the 48ers. Then there were people who could cross into the West when the regime in Czechoslovakia slightly relaxed its regulations concerning travel to the West in the 1960s. Then there were the people who left the country after the Soviet invasion in August 1968, let's say in the years 1968, 69, possibly also 1970. Those were generally called the 68ers. Then there was another dividing line between Slovak nationalists and Slovak people who were in favor of a common state of Czechs and Slovaks. So all these tribes, and some were organized according to the pre-1948 political structure in Czechoslovakia. That is, there was a tribe of people who continued the traditions of the Christian Democratic People's Party, and another tribe that continued the traditions of the so-called National Socialist Party of Czechoslovakia, which was the party of President Beneš, the last democratically elected president of Czechoslovakia. And all these tribes, whenever a slot came up, a job opportunity came up within the department, were competing, so to speak, to get their candidate to the job. And I was basically a clean piece of paper. I was not a member of any of these tribes, although I left in 1969 and could therefore be somehow counted among the 68ers. I had not been politically active in Czechoslovakia, obviously, because I was 17 when I left with Czechoslovakia with my parents to go to Bavaria. So I couldn't be supported by any of these tribes. And when I applied a number of times out of London to get a job with Radio Free Europe in Munich, I was usually told that I was well qualified, but the job went to somebody else. Eventually, I had a call from Washington from a friend called Paula Dobriansky, who was with me at university in the States. And she had found her way into the administration of the time and was working as a Soviet expert on the National Security Council in Washington. And she had heard that I was trying to get a job with Radio Free Europe and asked me in the spring of 1987 whether I was still interested. And I said, yes, of course I was. And she said, well, it so happens that Radio Free Europe will have a new director called Greg Wierzyński, an American journalist of good standing with the Polish ancestry. And he was making the rounds in Washington to the various government agencies before his planned departure for Munich. And he would also stop by at the National Security Council. And should she, Paula, mention my name to him? And I said, yes, by all means. So she did, and soon after I got a call from Greg Wierzyński's office in Munich asking me to come around and speak to Greg about my wish to work in Munich. which I did a couple of weeks later. And we got on very well together. This also applies to his then deputy, Joel Blocker, another journalist who had been working for Newsweek and was a war correspondent in Vietnam, and so on and so on. Both men were very nice to me and favored my appointment. So we agreed that I would come in the autumn of 1987, and that's how it worked out. I left the BBC in October 1987 and arrived at the Radio Free Europe headquarters in Munich the following month, and was immediately appointed special assistant to the director of RFE and his deputy, with the task of informing them in the course of every day of the so-called news flow, that is, of the situation in mostly the target area, that is Eastern Europe and the area of the Soviet Union, because these people in the top management were often burdened with many administrative tasks and did not have the time to follow the news flow throughout the day. So they needed somebody like me with my language skills and with my experience and with my knowledge of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union to inform them of developments, of significant developments in the target area, to warn them of possible problems in the work of the radios, in their work with the news coming from the East, to tell them which news items should not be used in our broadcasts because they were erroneous or they were inflammatory, as we called them. That is, to give you an example, at the time the war between the Armenians and Azerbaijanis over Nagorno-Karabakh was in full swing, and my task was to make sure that Azerbaijani chauvinist propaganda and Armenian nationalist propaganda would not find its way into our broadcasts because it might inflame the existing tensions. So that was my task for the first year and a half, working in Munich for the American leadership of the radios.
So if I understand correctly, you didn't work for the Czech section, or whether you called it like that, I don't know.
It was complicated. I was hired by the Czechoslovak service of Radio Free Europe, but was immediately withdrawn from it by the gentleman I mentioned, by the director of Radio Free Europe, Greg Rajinsky, and his deputy, Joel Blocker. And I only joined the Czechoslovak service about 14 months later, at the beginning of 1989, the year of miracles in Eastern Europe.
So you basically, very soon afterwards, you went to Prague, right, as a correspondent?
Yes, fairly soon, because then, you know what happened in 1989. We had the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia and a set of other revolutions around the Soviet bloc. And I was able to re-enter Czechoslovakia after a long hiatus again in December of 1989, when I went to cover the Special Congress of the Czechoslovak Communist Party, which convened in Prague, to sort of self-criticize itself, to acknowledge that the Communist Party had committed a number of grave mistakes and even crimes, and to reorganize its agenda in order to be able to survive in the new democratic environment, which of course was very interesting to me and entertaining in a way, because to see all those old comrades saying how things would now be much better and how they would behave properly and so on was very, very entertaining.
You know, Peter, you recently described the differences between the BBC World Service and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in our kind of sister podcast, Prague Talk with Ian Willoughby. But let me ask you again, what were the basic differences between working for BBC World Service and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty?
Okay, there were several basic differences. Obviously, the coverage of the BBC was of a different orientation than the coverage of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. The last two sister stations had the main task of informing people in target areas that were part of the communist-dominated bloc, or the Soviet bloc. We at Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty covered the rest of the world as well, but the ratio between the two areas, let's call them in a simplified way, the West and the East, was quite different to that ratio in the BBC coverage. And the BBC coverage also was devoted in a much greater extent to events, let's say, in the Third World, in Latin America, in South Asia, and so on and so on. The BBC was truly a world radio station, interested in anything that went on anywhere, if it was of significance, transgressing the local borders. In Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, we were mainly aiming to inform the target areas, or people in the target areas, of events that were directly concerning them or relevant to them, of internal developments in their countries, if possible, if we had the material to cover those events, to inform them about the worldwide struggle between autocratic regimes, especially communist regimes, and democratic liberal societies, to inform them of dissident activities in the target area, and so on and so on. Things that were not that important in the worldwide coverage of the BBC, although they were covered too. But the main task of the BBC was to inform evenly about all parts of the world, which in the Czechoslovak service of the BBC in London, for example, led to certain pressures in which we younger people were involved, we were addressed by those pressures from our management, not to devote too much time to dissident activities in Eastern Europe. Obviously, this was almost impossible to follow. It was almost impossible to follow such advice in, let's say, 1980-81, when solidarity came to the fore in Poland, but then it was acknowledged that that was a very significant development. But later on, the dissident activities in countries where such anti-government movements did not emerge, like Czechoslovakia or Bulgaria, Hungary, and so on, were given less attention. And we, the younger members of the editorial offices concerned with Eastern Europe, were somewhat impatient and wanted to include more material about dissident activities in our target areas. And occasionally this led to tensions with our lead editors, who were of Czech and Slovak origin, and with our top management, which was basically British. So that one of the reasons I wanted to go to Munich to serve in Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty was that I simply wanted to devote it a larger part of my working time to events directly concerning the target areas, events in the communist area that would eventually, we hoped, lead to the demise of the communist regime.
I totally understand that, but from your description of the kind of social situation, if I may call it so, in the Czechoslovak section at Radio Free Europe, wasn't it kind of difficult to fit in, to deal with your colleagues who were divided by so many, fracture lines that you mentioned, be it religion, be it nationality, because it was Czechoslovak?
Well, it wasn't that difficult for me, but then remember that I spent the first time when I was employed by Radio Free Europe as part of the American management, and therefore my position was somewhat special. And when I went to work in the Czechoslovak service, I was considered by many as a sort of plant of the American management. As somebody, I was recognized as somebody with a strong Western experience, very different from most of my colleagues, because I had come to the West at the age of 17. I had finished high school in Munich. I had studied at Western universities in Munich, in London, and in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I had a very different background from most of my colleagues, and also not being aligned to any of the political factions. I was left in peace in those terms. I was not drawn into the sometimes petty conflicts concerning the political line of the editorial office, which somehow emanated from old struggles between the Czechoslovak political parties before 1948. That was not something that somehow affected me. And I was recognized, I was accepted as an experienced journalist because of my 7 years with the BBC and because of my language skills and my knowledge of political circumstances in the East and so on. So I had no problem in that respect.
You are listening to Czechcast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka, your host, and my guest today is Petr Brod, I dare say, one of the most significant Czech journalists of late 20th and early 21st century. Let me share kind of memory from the 1980s when I was a student of English, and I actually liked to listen to BBC World Service in English, especially after the jamming stopped under Gorbachev, and the reception was really good. But of course, I would mix it with listening to Radio Free Europe from Munich. And even then, and I'm not saying that it was good or bad, I felt that I was kind of led to a certain position by Radio Free Europe. But that was the intention, wasn't it? That was the raison d'être, to say it in French, of Radio Free Europe.
Yes, the radios were founded in the late 40s, early 50s as stations that would fight for Western values against a mighty totalitarian regime symbolized by Joseph Stalin and the Bolsheviks in the Kremlin. So there was no doubt about their raison d'être, their aim of existence. And there's another difference to the BBC. The time spent by the BBC on each country in terms of broadcasting to it was very much smaller than the time spent in Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe. To give you an example, which you probably know, we would spend about 2 to 3 hours per day broadcasting to Czechoslovakia from London, while the service was more or less round the clock. And that led to the fact that programs in Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty could go much deeper than those in the BBC, which the BBC basically concentrated on news and current affairs, while Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty had enough time to give attention to most social groups, including workers, including agriculturalists, including intellectuals, including cultural workers, so that there were programs for the young people, for those working in agriculture, for industrial workers, for those interested in culture, for those interested in pop music, etc., etc. And within each of those fields, you could, of course, stress the differences between the West and the East, and you could stress the advantages that people enjoyed when living in the West against the disadvantages living under communist rule. So this is probably the educational line that you noticed in the RFE broadcasts.
Now, I don't want you to do my homework for me, but if you were to explain to the listeners what kind of, I would say even venerable names of Czech journalism and Czech literature as well were connected with Radio Free Europe when it broadcast from Munich in the 1970s, 1980s, and perhaps earlier as well.
Earlier would be simpler for me to recall because at the founding of the radios were present such personalities as Ferdinand Peroutka and Pavel Tigrit, who were the best known journalists in exile, and before that they were very well known in Czechoslovakia as authors and journalists. There were some writers who transferred from Czechoslovakia to the West who were working for the radios. My cousin Peter Demetz, who later became known as the author of several important books about the cultural history of Czechoslovakia and was based in America later on, was the first cultural editor of Radio Free Europe in Munich. There were several authors from the Catholic wing of Czech literature working for Radio Free Europe. There were former politicians working in the radios. Let me recall, for example, Samuel Beluš, who was a Slovak politician who was active as the minister of the autonomous government of Slovakia after the liberation of Czechoslovakia in 1945, and who fled to the West when the communists came to power. So yes, there were many important people of Czech politics and culture working either inside the headquarters of RFE in Munich or as outside contributors. And in the 1970s and 80s, as you mentioned, among the authors that we interviewed were, for example, Arnošt Lustig or Josef Škorecký, very important contemporary writers. There were many artists who were living in exiles in the West. Some writers became members of the editorial office in Munich, for example, Ivan Binar, who is still alive and who was an important fiction author. So yes, it was a very good environment to be working in, and let me refer, last not least, to Karel Kryl, a wonderful poet and folk singer who became an iconic figure of Czech resistance against communism, and whose songs have become folk songs, so to speak, because even today's young people know them, sing them, and he was probably the best known contributor to broadcasts of Radio Free Europe in Czech, and was as such welcomed by masses when he was able to return to Czechoslovakia in late 1989, and then performed for several years in Czechoslovakia before his early death.
I suppose what I was trying to ask, and you just confirmed it, Radio Free Europe, the Czechoslovak section, it was a kind of, I would say, cultural institution financed by the United States at that time. Were you surprised when the US decided that they would kind of discontinue the broadcast in Czech and Slovak?
Well, it wasn't a great surprise because one was, so to speak, trained for such closures. Let's mention the BBC again. The BBC finished its broadcasts in Czech and Slovak in 2006, having come to the conclusion that it was probably not sensible anymore, either in intellectual terms or in financial terms, to broadcast into countries that were by now, I'm talking of the year 2006, members of both NATO and the European Union, which is a strong argument. Yes, you could say that as long as these countries were under the sway of the Soviet Union, it was much more sensible to try to inform their populations about events in the outside world and even events inside those countries. So one could argue that it was to be expected that one day even the United States would come to the conclusion that broadcasting into areas which were originally under autocratic regimes would not be sensible anymore. The problem is that here we are witnessing the possible demise of an institution that still broadcasts into countries ruled by autocratic regimes, be they of a nationalist kind or of a sort of, how shall I put it, post-communist kind, such as the countries in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on, where mostly the former communist elites transform themselves into nationalist elites and are employing authoritarian methods still. So that we are not seeing the demise of broadcasts into democratic countries as they were in the case of the BBC when it decided to close down the Polish and Hungarian and Czech and Slovak services and so on. But we are witnessing something that necessarily will bring joy and how shall I put it, will lighten the burden of the autocratic countries, leaders of those autocratic countries in Eastern Europe, such as Belarus, or in Central Asia, such as Kyrgyzstan, or elsewhere in the Caucasus and so on. And that is the main difference. But as I said, I was prepared for some closures, but not for the closures of this kind that we are seeing. And these are closures that are based on wrong assumptions, I think, the epitome of which is what is being said by Elon Musk, who has commented and who has pressured, in fact, President Trump to close down those services like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty by saying that they were institutions in which extreme leftist journalists were talking to themselves, which is complete nonsense and shows that the current administration in Washington, although it could know better, has no idea of the role and work of these institutions, that it's not based on any real experience, although they have oversight bodies which could inform them about the daily work of these radios, which is very, very professional and non-partisan, and to the advantage of the Western worldview and to the disadvantage of autocratic rulers in the target area.
What would you say to the idea, that the present administration simply doesn't see RFE, RL as relevant in this world of X, of, social networks, when people really, especially young people, consume information in a completely different way than the traditional ones that both you and I grew up with?
That may be true to some extent, but let's not forget that these media, although they are called radios, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, have followed modern trends and have very good websites, for example. They have television outlets and podcast outlets and so on and so on. So they have grown with time and followed modern trends and can reach even young people, let's say, who are interested in podcasts only. So I wouldn't see a real reason for closing them down in a lack of modern means of communication.
One thing that has been kind of surprising me, if I can say so, is that the media, and not just in Czechia, all over Europe, and American media are still able to be surprised by the steps of the present administration in the United States, if you understand what I mean. They are just doing what they said that they would do.
Well, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty did not play such a big role in
the campaign. I admit that,
what
yeah.
the administration announced as their big plans. But yes, there is an element of what you're saying in that the administration under Trump is trying to reorient foreign policy of the foreign policies of the United States towards Eastern Asia, towards the conflict between the United States and China in various fields, mainly in the field of trade, and therefore Europe, places like Central Asia, get a diminished role in the American worldview under Trump. And therefore, you could say that the demise of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty is a secondary consequence of the new dimensions or the new views of the new administration as far as global changes are concerned. Europe has lost its importance in American foreign policy, which is partly its own fault, of course, because, as we know, unifying some 30 countries into a coherent policy on everything is very difficult. And the Americans are sometimes finding it difficult to know whom to call in Europe, as Kissinger once put it. They find it all the more difficult because they don't have the knowledge that Kissinger had at his disposal about European history and politics. So in that respect, there is a rationale between what is happening in that America wants to concentrate on different world regions than Europe and, let's say, Eurasia. But on the other hand, I think that the present administration is miscalculating American interests, that it does not acknowledge that it is in America's interest to hold back Russian expansion, that the Americans don't take seriously what is being repeated daily by Russian propaganda, namely that they want to set out and conquer the areas that used to belong to the Soviet bloc, and that therefore, in consequence, this is a danger, an existential threat to Western countries, to the Euro-Atlantic world. That is not something that enters the mind of such people as Trump and Elon Musk.
Have you been in touch with some of your former colleagues at RFE RL?
Yes, I've been in touch with my former colleagues. With many of them, we have a sort of chat group of the former top managers and leading editors and so on. And they're all disillusioned, angry, ashamed of current American policies. But we simply don't know whether that's really the end or not, because Congress can step in. Now, we know that the Congress right now is in both houses dominated by Trumpian Republicans, but the Agency for Global Media, which oversees foreign broadcasting from the United States, and the individual components of that broadcasting, like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, are still being fully funded by Congress, and something will have to be done there, and we'll see how the members of the House of Representatives and the senators behave when they see what's happening, the chaos that's being created by this administration, the steps that are considered unlawful even by many judges. They will see what echo the planned demise of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty has already created in the target areas. They will hopefully consider what damage might be done to American interests abroad in important world regions. So I hope that something might happen in Congress which will result in possibly a compromise. I also find it important to watch what happens to the broadcast to Cuba, for example, because it seems to me strange that such broadcasts should cease at a time when the Secretary of State in the United States, i.e. the Foreign Minister, is Marco Rubio, who is himself of Cuban descent. So I think we're in for more surprises, good and bad, I'm afraid, but it may not be the end of the story as we know it.
So that was Petr Brod, journalist with a deep personal connection to the mission and legacy of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. If this episode gave you something to think about, or perhaps brought back memories of your own, please consider sharing it with a friend, or better yet, subscribing to Czechcast. That way, you'll never miss a conversation that dives deeper into Czech life, history and identity. I'm Vít Pohanka, this has been Czechcast, thanks for listening a naslyšenou.
Czechcast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.